My husband looked me dead in the eye across a crowded cafe table and said the words that would change everything. "You're too stupid to understand basic business concepts, Vic. Maybe that's why you're still doing logo designs for mom-and-pop shops." His friends erupted in laughter as I sat frozen, my untouched latte growing cold between my trembling hands. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 months later, those same friends stood speechless in their designer suits at a Charleston gallery opening, watching me unveil a brand identity campaign for a Fortune 500 company while the man beside me, the gallery owner worth 10 times what Derek would ever make, introduced me as his fiancée. The look on Derek's face when he realized who I'd become, who I was marrying, and how spectacularly he destroyed his own life made every tear I'd cried worth it. The morning of that cafe meeting started like any other Wednesday in my life with Derek Hayes. I woke up in our downtown Portland loft, the kind of space featured in architecture magazines with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River. Everything about our home screamed success, from the Italian leather furniture to the abstract art pieces Derek insisted we purchase from galleries I found pretentious. I had designed the color scheme myself, a feat Derek took credit for whenever guests complimented the space. Looking back, that should have been my first real warning sign, but I was too busy being grateful that someone like Derek had chosen someone like me. I met Derek Hayes 5 years earlier at a networking mixer I almost didn't attend. Fresh out of graduate school with a master's in visual communications, drowning in student loan debt, I was working as a junior designer at Cascade Marketing Group, taking on any freelance work I could find on weekends. Derek was already making waves in Portland's commercial real estate scene, the golden boy who could spot an up-and-coming neighborhood before anyone else, the guy who turned abandoned warehouses into luxury condos that sold out before construction finished. He had confidence that filled entire rooms, the kind of presence that made you sit up straighter when he walked by. When he approached me that night, asking about the design work displayed on the screens around the venue, I assumed he was being polite. But he kept talking, kept asking questions, seemed genuinely interested in how I conceptualized brand identities for startups. He told me I had a gift for seeing potential where others saw nothing, that my work reminded him of his own approach to real estate. By the end of the evening, I had his number and a strange flutter in my chest that felt like possibility. Our courtship moved quickly. Derek was 15 years older than me, established in ways I desperately wanted to be. He took me to restaurants where I had to Google the dress code, introduced me to people whose names I recognized from local business journals, made me feel like I was finally entering a world I'd only observed from the outside. When he proposed after 18 months, in front of his entire family at his parents' estate in the West Hills, I said yes because I believed I was the luckiest woman alive. Derek Hayes, the man everyone wanted to know, had chosen me. Helen Garrison, my former professor who had become my boss and mentor at Cascade Marketing, expressed concern the week I announced my engagement. She called me into her corner office, the one filled with awards from 3 decades in the industry, and closed the door. "Victoria, I need you to hear something that might be difficult," she said, her silver hair catching the afternoon light. "I've met Derek a few times now at your company events. He's charming, successful, absolutely. But I've noticed he has a way of diminishing your accomplishments when he talks about your work." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "A partner should be your loudest champion, not someone who makes themselves bigger by making you smaller." I dismissed her concerns as generational differences, told myself Helen didn't understand modern relationships, convinced myself that Derek's occasional corrections or clarifications were just him trying to help me navigate the business world he knew so well. After all, he had introduced me to 3 major clients in that first year. Wasn't that proof of his support? I ignored the way he'd edit my sentences at dinner parties, the subtle eye rolls when I offered opinions on topics he considered his territory, the increasing frequency with which he'd interrupt me mid-story to add what he felt were crucial details I'd left out. The wedding was everything Derek wanted. His family owned Hayes Development Corporation, a commercial real estate empire his father Richard had built over 40 years. The guest list included city council members, prominent developers, and more business contacts than actual friends or family. I had wanted something smaller, more intimate, maybe overlooking the coast, but Derek convinced me that a wedding was an opportunity to make the right impression. We married at the Arlington Club, Portland's oldest private social club, in a ceremony that cost more than my parents had made in 5 years of combined income. My mother cried, though I couldn't tell if it was from joy or concern. Marriage to Derek meant becoming Mrs. Hayes, a role that came with expectations I hadn't fully understood when I accepted his proposal. There were charity galas where I needed to wear the right designers, dinner parties where I was expected to be charming but not too opinionated, business functions where Derek would introduce me as his wife who does some design work on the side. That last part stung every time because design wasn't something I did on the side. It was my passion, my career, my identity beyond being Derek's wife. But contradicting him in public became something I learned not to do after the first few times resulted in tense car rides home and lectures about not undermining him in front of important people. Helen kept me grounded during those first 3 years of marriage. At Cascade Marketing, I was Victoria Hayes, senior brand strategist, the person clients specifically requested for their campaigns. I had developed a reputation for transforming struggling businesses through visual storytelling, for understanding the emotional psychology behind consumer choices, for creating identities that felt authentic rather than manufactured. My work won regional awards. I brought in 6-figure contracts. I mentored junior designers the way Helen had mentored me. At the office, I remembered who I was before I became Derek's wife. But that version of myself seemed to shrink every time I came home. Derek had opinions about my work that he'd share over dinner, critiques about why a logo I'd spent weeks developing wasn't as strong as I thought, suggestions that I was overcomplicating concepts that should be simple. When I landed a major contract with a Portland-based outdoor apparel company, designing their complete rebrand, Derek's first response was to point out that his introduction to the CEO's brother-in-law had probably influenced their decision. When the campaign launched to industry praise, he reminded me not to let success go to my head, that consistency mattered more than one-hit wonders. The shift in our marriage accelerated about 8 months before that cafe meeting. Derek hired Brianna Caldwell as a property manager for Hayes Development Corporation. She was 32, ambitious, possessed the kind of aggressive confidence Derek admired in the business world. She understood commercial real estate, could talk cap rates and property values with the same fluency Derek spoke. I met her twice at company functions, noticed how she laughed at all Derek's jokes, how she touched his arm when making a point, how Derek's entire demeanor changed around her, becoming more animated, more engaged than I'd seen him in months. I told myself I was being paranoid when Derek started working later, when business dinners became more frequent, when his phone became something he kept face down on tables and took to the bathroom with him. Trust was supposed to be foundational to marriage, and accusing my husband of infidelity based on a feeling seemed like exactly the kind of emotional overreaction Derek had taught me to avoid. So I said nothing, worked on my projects, and tried to be the wife Derek needed me to be. The morning of the cafe incident, Derek texted me during my department meeting. Need to discuss something important. Meet me at the Brew Haven at noon. Bringing Trevor and Kyle. The message felt odd because Derek never included me in his friend meetups, especially not with Trevor Moss and Kyle Brennan, his college buddies who visited from Seattle quarterly to relive their fraternity glory days. But I finished my presentation on a new client pitch, told Helen I'd be back by 2, and walked the 4 blocks to the Brew Haven with no idea my entire life was about to detonate. The Brew Haven was one of those trendy Portland cafes with exposed brick, reclaimed wood tables, and a menu featuring 17 varieties of artisanal toast. Derek loved bringing business associates there because it projected the right image, casual but successful, approachable but discriminating. When I arrived, he was already seated at a corner table with Trevor, Kyle, and surprisingly, Ethan Park, another member of their old circle. For men in expensive casual wear, leaning back in their chairs with the easy confidence of people who'd never questioned their place in the world. Derek didn't stand when I approached, didn't smile. He gestured to the empty chair across from him like I was a business associate arriving for a meeting rather than his wife joining what I'd assumed was lunch. I should have turned around right then, but I sat down, ordered a latte I didn't want, and waited for Derek to explain why he'd summoned me to a cafe in the middle of a workday with an audience of his friends. He started with small talk, asking about my morning like we were acquaintances catching up. Trevor and Kyle exchanged glances that made me uncomfortable, like they knew something I didn't, like they were waiting for a show to begin. Ethan at least had the decency to look somewhat uncomfortable, studying his coffee with more interest than it deserved. The conversation felt performative, Derek asking questions he didn't care about, me giving answers to fill the awkward silence. Then Derek shifted forward, his expression changing to something I'd seen him use in business negotiations, that look of practiced concern that preceded delivering bad news. Vic, I need to be honest with you about something, and I'm doing this here because I think having witnesses prevents the situation from becoming overly emotional. My stomach dropped. The phrasing, the setting, the audience, everything screamed that I was about to be ambushed, but I couldn't leave, couldn't move, could only sit there as my husband prepared to destroy me in front of his friends at a cafe that smelled like burnt espresso and hipster aspirations. I'm not happy, Derek continued, his tone suggesting he was explaining a simple business concept to someone of limited understanding. I haven't been happy for a while now, and I think you know that if you're honest with yourself. I opened my mouth to respond, but he held up a hand to silence me, a gesture he'd perfected over our marriage. Let me finish. We've grown in different directions. You're content with your small client projects and your modest success at Cascade. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm building an empire. I need a partner who operates at my level, someone who understands the world I'm moving in. The words hit me like physical blows, each sentence more devastating than the last. Trevor was nodding along like Derek was making excellent points. Kyle had pulled out his phone, either uncomfortable or documenting the moment, I couldn't tell. Ethan was still studying his coffee cup like it held the secrets of the universe. And Derek just kept talking, listing my inadequacies like he was reviewing a disappointing employee's performance. You don't engage with my colleagues in meaningful ways, he said. At the last charity gala, you talked to Richard's client about typography for 20 minutes while I was trying to close a deal. Typography, Vic. Do you understand how that looks? That my wife can't hold a conversation about anything substantial? I felt heat rising to my face, shame mixing with confusion mixing with the first stirrings of anger. I had talked to that client about a rebranding project he'd mentioned wanting to explore, had offered genuine insight about visual communication strategies, but apparently that was inappropriate, too trivial for Derek's important business world. But the moment that shattered everything came when Derek leaned back, crossed his arms, and delivered his final assessment with Trevor and Kyle grinning beside him. The truth is, Vic, you're too stupid to understand basic business concepts. Maybe that's why you're still doing logo designs for mom-and-pop shops instead of working on anything that actually matters. That's when Trevor and Kyle laughed, not polite chuckles but full-throated amusement, like Derek had delivered the punchline to a joke they'd all been waiting for. The cafe noise faded to white static. I watched Derek's mouth keep moving, explaining that he'd already consulted with a divorce attorney, that he'd be reasonable about asset division, that he hoped we could handle this like adults. But I couldn't hear the words anymore over the roaring in my ears, over the humiliation of being called stupid in public, over the casual cruelty of a man I'd loved reducing me to someone too dim to understand his important world. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the table to keep them still. He's already moved on, Trevor added helpfully, apparently deciding to contribute to my destruction. Brianna's great, man. You two make way more sense together. The confirmation of what I'd suspected for months should have hurt worse, but honestly, at that point, the infidelity felt almost secondary to the public humiliation. Derek had brought his friends to watch him call me stupid and announce his affair like it was entertainment, like I was someone who deserved this treatment, like our 5 years together meant absolutely nothing. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't give them the emotional scene Derek had probably anticipated and prepared for. Instead, I stood up with as much dignity as I could gather, picked up my untouched latte, and for one glorious moment considered throwing it in Derek's face. But even in my devastation, some part of me refused to give him the satisfaction of calling me unstable or emotional or any of the other words men like Derek used to dismiss women's justified anger. So I simply set the cup back down, looked at my husband, and said with a steadiness that surprised even me, "You're absolutely right, Derek. We should have done this a long time ago." I walked out of the brew haven with my head high and my world in pieces. The Portland afternoon was absurdly beautiful, all blue skies and perfect spring weather, completely indifferent to the fact that my marriage had just ended in the most humiliating way possible. I made it 2 blocks before my legs started shaking so badly I had to sit down on a bench near the waterfront. That's where the tears finally came, silent and relentless, for the marriage I'd lost, for the person I'd allowed myself to become, for the years I'd spent making myself smaller so Derek could feel bigger. My phone buzzed with a text from Helen. Client meeting ran long. Everything okay? I stared at the message for a long time before typing back a lie. All good. Be back soon. But I wasn't going back to the office that day. I wasn't going back to the loft I shared with Derek. I wasn't going back to any part of the life I'd been living because that life had just been incinerated in a trendy cafe by a man who thought I was too stupid to deserve respect. Instead, I walked to my car, drove to a hotel near the airport, and checked in using a credit card Derek didn't know about, one I'd kept from before our marriage in an account he'd never asked about. The hotel room was generic and impersonal and exactly what I needed. I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the outfit I'd chosen that morning when I was still a wife with a career and a home and some semblance of a future, and I let myself fall apart completely. Hours passed in a blur of tears and rage and grief. I ignored calls from Derek, from his mother, from numbers I didn't recognize that were probably his attorney. When Helen called, I almost didn't answer, but some instinct made me pick up. Victoria, Naomi Fletcher just called me, Helen said, her voice tight with anger. She heard what happened. She told me everything. Where are you? Are you safe? Naomi was Derek's younger sister, one of the few members of his family I'd actually connected with, someone I'd assumed would side with her brother when the marriage ended. I'm at a hotel, I managed to say through tears. I can't go back there, Helen. I can't face any of them. You don't have to, Helen replied firmly. Listen to me carefully. You're going to stay exactly where you are tonight. Tomorrow, you're going to come to my house. We're going to make a plan. And Victoria? Derek Hayes just made the biggest mistake of his pathetic life. You're going to be fine. Better than fine. But first, you need to let yourself grieve what you've lost. So cry tonight. Scream if you need to. Then tomorrow, we rebuild. I cried until I had no tears left, until my head pounded and my eyes were swollen and my throat was raw. Then I took a shower so hot it left my skin red, put on the hotel bathrobe, and stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me was someone I barely recognized, someone who'd spent 5 years accommodating and diminishing and apologizing for taking up space. But underneath the tear-stained face and the heartbreak, I could still see traces of the person I'd been before Derek, the ambitious graduate student who believed she could build something meaningful, who had talent and vision and drive that no cruel husband could actually take away. That night, lying in a generic hotel bed, I made myself a promise. Derek Hayes had called me stupid in front of his friends, had humiliated me in the most public way possible, had tried to reduce me to someone small and insignificant. I would prove him wrong in ways he couldn't imagine. I would disappear from his world completely and build something so extraordinary that if our paths ever crossed again, he would choke on his regret. This wasn't about revenge in the petty sense. This was about reclaiming the person I'd been before Derek convinced me I was less than I was. This was about justice that came from living so well that my success became undeniable. By morning, the tears had stopped. In their place was something harder, something sharper, something that felt like the beginning of becoming whole again. I checked out of the hotel, drove to Helen's house in the Pearl District, and walked into her kitchen to find not just my mentor but Naomi Fletcher sitting at the breakfast table, her expression furious and determined. She stood up when she saw me, pulled me into a hug, and whispered, "My brother is a coward and a fool. Whatever you need, I'm on your side." That's when I knew I wasn't alone in this, that I had people who saw my worth even when I'd forgotten it myself. What happened at that cafe was the end of one version of my life. But as I sat at Helen's table, drinking coffee that actually tasted good, surrounded by women who believed in me, I understood it was also the beginning of something else entirely. Derek thought he'd destroyed me with his cruel words and public humiliation. He had no idea he'd actually set me free. The legal paperwork arrived at Helen's house 3 days after the cafe incident. Derek's attorney had drawn up divorce documents with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before, probably for other men who'd upgraded their wives like they were trading in last year's luxury car model. The settlement offer was insulting in its generosity, designed to make Derek look magnanimous while actually protecting his assets. He'd keep the loft, naturally, since it was purchased before our marriage with his family money. I'd get my car, my personal belongings, and a lump sum payment that amounted to roughly 6 months of his annual income, a sum that would sound substantial to most people but was pocket change in Derek's world. Helen read through the documents with the sharp eye of someone who'd survived her own divorce 2 decades earlier. She pointed out clauses designed to prevent me from making claims on his business interests, non-disparagement agreements that would legally prohibit me from discussing our marriage publicly, timelines that rushed the process before I could properly assess what I was entitled to. "This is designed to make you go away quietly," she said, tapping a perfectly manicured nail against the stack of papers. "He wants you erased from his life as quickly and cleanly as possible, with no mess, no drama, no inconvenient truths about why the marriage actually ended." Naomi had her own interpretation when she stopped by that evening with takeout from a Thai restaurant I'd once told her I loved, a small gesture that made me cry for the first time since that initial night. "My brother is terrified you're going to tell people what he did," she said bluntly, spreading pad thai and green curry across Helen's dining table. "The cafe humiliation, the affair with Brianna, all of it. His reputation in Portland is everything to him. This settlement is hush money dressed up as fairness." She paused, studying my face. "What are you going to do?" I picked at my food, appetite still mostly absent despite not having eaten properly in days. The old Victoria, the one who'd spent 5 years trying to be the wife Derek needed, would have signed those papers immediately. Would have taken the money, stayed quiet, maybe even thanked him for being reasonable about the whole thing. But something had crystallized in me during those long hours at the hotel, during the nights I'd spend at Helen's house staring at her guest room ceiling. I wasn't that woman anymore. I couldn't be, even if I wanted to. "I'm going to hire my own attorney," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "I'm going to make sure this divorce reflects reality, not Derek's preferred fiction. And then I'm going to disappear so completely that he'll never see me coming back." Both women smiled, the kind of fierce, proud expressions that told me I'd said exactly what they'd hoped to hear. Helen pulled out her phone and texted me contact information for an attorney she described as a shark in expensive heels who specialized in complex asset division. Naomi poured 3 glasses of wine and raised hers in a toast. "To my idiot brother's worst decision, and to your best life starting right now." The next 2 weeks were a blur of legal consultations, document reviews, and strategic planning that had nothing to do with my marriage and everything to do with my future. Helen's attorney friend, a woman named Patricia Chen who wore power suits like armor and had a reputation for destroying men who thought they could bully their way through divorces, took one look at Derek's settlement offer and laughed out loud. "He must think you're as stupid as he called you in that cafe," she said, which Naomi had apparently shared in graphic detail. "Let's show him exactly how intelligent you actually are." Patricia filed a response that requested full financial disclosure, questioned the valuation of marital assets, and indicated we'd be seeking a significantly larger settlement based on my contributions to Derek's career advancement during our marriage. More importantly, she included depositions from 3 individuals who'd witnessed the cafe incident, documenting the emotional abuse and public humiliation. Not because we intended to use it in court, but because we wanted Derek to know that his dirty laundry wasn't as private as he'd assumed. The message was clear. Play fair, or everyone in Portland's business community would learn exactly what kind of man Derek Hayes really was. Derek's response came through his attorney, of course, because he hadn't spoken to me directly since that cafe meeting. The revised offer was substantially better, closer to what Patricia felt I actually deserved, though still structured to get me out of Derek's life as quickly as possible. I could have pushed for more, could have dragged out the process, could have made his life difficult in all the ways he'd made mine small. But I wasn't interested in spending another 6 months tied to Derek Hayes through legal battles. I wanted to be free of him entirely, and freedom was worth more than any financial settlement. I signed the final papers in Patricia's downtown office on a Tuesday morning exactly 5 weeks after Derek called me stupid in front of his friends. The settlement included a substantial cash payment, my car, all my personal property, and importantly, an ironclad agreement that neither party would discuss the marriage or its dissolution publicly. Derek got his silence, his reputation protected, his new relationship with Brianna free to proceed without the messiness of an angry ex-wife. What he didn't know was that I didn't need to talk about him publicly. I just needed him to forget I existed long enough for me to become someone he wouldn't recognize. While the divorce processed, I'd been making other plans with the kind of strategic thinking Derek had always assumed I wasn't capable of. I gave my notice at Cascade Marketing, a decision that devastated Helen but that she understood completely. Portland held too many memories, too many places where I might run into Derek or his circle, too many reminders of who I'd been when I was trying to be Mrs. Hayes. I needed geographic distance to complete my transformation, needed to build something in a place where nobody knew my story, where I could be just Victoria Hayes, talented designer, rather than Derek's stupid ex-wife. Charleston, South Carolina emerged as my destination through a combination of research and intuition. The city was experiencing a creative renaissance, attracting young professionals and established artists who were drawn to its historic beauty and growing tech scene. The cost of living was reasonable compared to Portland. The design community was active but not oversaturated. Most importantly, it was on the opposite side of the country, far enough that I'd never accidentally run into anyone from my old life, far enough that I could become someone new. Helen helped me craft a portfolio that showcased my strongest work, the campaigns I'd led at Cascade that had won regional awards, the brand identities I'd developed that transformed struggling businesses into thriving ones. We carefully removed any mention of Portland clients Derek had introduced me to, building a body of work that stood entirely on my own merit. Then she did something I hadn't expected. She called a former colleague who'd relocated to Charleston 5 years earlier, a woman named Diane Rothschild who owned a boutique creative studio called Magnolia Creative. Diane and I spoke on the phone for 2 hours, discussing design philosophy, my approach to brand strategy, what I was looking for in my next position. She asked about my marriage ending, not in a gossipy way but in acknowledgement that major life changes often precipitated career transitions. I told her the simplified version, that my husband and I had grown apart, that I needed a fresh start somewhere new. I didn't mention the cafe, the humiliation, the years of being made small. That story was mine to carry, not something I needed to explain to potential employers. 2 days later, Diane offered me a position as senior brand strategist at Magnolia Creative, with a salary that actually reflected my experience and value. The studio was small, just 12 people, but they worked with impressive clients throughout the Southeast, from Charleston tech startups to Atlanta-based corporations looking to refresh their visual identities. It wasn't quite the executive role I'd held at Cascade, but it was a legitimate position at a respected firm, and more importantly, it was mine. No connection to Derek, no shadow of being someone's wife, just an opportunity earned through my actual talent. I left Portland on a Sunday morning in early June, my car packed with everything that mattered to me. Helen stood in her driveway as I loaded the last box, her eyes wet but her smile genuine. "You're going to do extraordinary things, Victoria," she said, pulling me into a hug that lasted longer than usual. "And when you do, when you're exactly where you're meant to be, I want you to remember that Derek Hayes couldn't see your value because he was too busy protecting his own fragile ego. His loss is the world's gain." Naomi had stopped by the night before with a care package for the drive and a letter she made me promise not to open until I reached Charleston. Both women had become the family I needed when my marriage family had crumbled, and leaving them was harder than leaving the city itself. The drive across the country took 4 days. I stayed in budget motels, ate at roadside diners, listened to podcasts about entrepreneurship and personal transformation. Somewhere in Tennessee, I stopped trying to analyze what had gone wrong in my marriage and started imagining what could go right in my future. By the time I crossed into South Carolina, I felt lighter than I had in years, like I'd physically left the weight of Derek's judgment somewhere back on Interstate 40. Charleston welcomed me with humidity I wasn't prepared for and beauty that took my breath away. The historic district with its rainbow row houses and cobblestone streets felt like stepping into a different era, romantic and preserved in ways Portland's constant development had never allowed. I found an apartment in a converted warehouse in the Upper Peninsula, exposed brick and large windows, modest but filled with light. It was a third of the size of the loft I'd shared with Derek, and I loved every square foot of it because it was entirely mine. Magnolia Creative Studios occupied the ground floor of a renovated cotton warehouse near the waterfront. The space was everything Cascade Marketing hadn't been: warm instead of corporate, collaborative instead of hierarchical, filled with plants and natural light and a genuine sense that people enjoyed being there. Diane introduced me to the team on my first day, and nobody asked about my past, about why I'd moved across the country, about anything except what I could bring to their projects. It was the first time in 5 years that I'd been seen as just Victoria, professional designer, rather than Victoria Hayes, Derek's wife who did some work on the side. The first month in Charleston was about establishing routines and rebuilding the parts of myself that had atrophied during my marriage. I woke early and walked along the Battery before work, watching sunrise paint the harbor in colors that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with visual arts in the first place. I threw myself into projects at Magnolia, staying late not because anyone expected it but because I'd forgotten how satisfying it felt to work without someone diminishing my efforts. I explored the city alone, trying new restaurants, visiting galleries, sitting in Waterfront Park with my sketchbook and remembering that creativity had once been joyful rather than something I did to prove my worth. My co-workers at Magnolia slowly became friends, though I kept my past deliberately vague. There was James, the web developer who made terrible puns and brilliant code. There was Kat, the copywriter who could craft brand narratives that made clients cry. There was Marcus, the junior designer fresh out of school who reminded me of myself before Derek, hungry and talented and full of ideas. They invited me to happy hours, weekend brunches, gallery openings. I went to some and declined others, still learning how to be social without the anxiety of wondering if I was representing Derek appropriately or embarrassing him with my conversation topics. 3 months into my Charleston life, Diane assigned me to lead a major rebrand for a regional healthcare network, the kind of high-stakes project that could define a designer's reputation. The existing identity was dated and inconsistent, doing nothing to communicate the organization's innovative approach to patient care. I dove into research, conducting stakeholder interviews, analyzing competitor positioning, developing mood boards that captured both medical professionalism and human warmth. The creative process felt pure in a way it hadn't since before my marriage, uncontaminated by Derek's voice in my head telling me I was overcomplicating things or missing obvious solutions. The presentation to the healthcare network's executive team was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in late September. I'd worked on the pitch deck for 3 weeks, refining every slide, anticipating every question, building a case for the brand direction that felt both bold and inevitable. Diane offered to present with me, but I asked to do it alone. I needed to prove to myself that I could command a room, that I could sell a vision, that Derek had been wrong about everything he'd ever said about my capabilities. The presentation lasted 90 minutes. I walked them through research findings, strategic positioning, visual identity concepts, implementation timelines. I fielded questions about budget, rollout phases, stakeholder buy-in. And when the chief marketing officer leaned back in her chair and said, "This is exactly what we needed but didn't know how to articulate," I felt something click into place inside me. This was who I was when nobody was making me smaller. This was the designer I'd always had the potential to be. Magnolia won the contract, the largest in the studio's history. Diane took the whole team out to celebrate at a restaurant overlooking the harbor, and for the first time since the divorce, I felt genuinely proud of something I'd accomplished. Not relieved, not grateful to have survived, but actually proud. That night, I opened the letter Naomi had given me before I left Portland, the one I'd been saving for when I needed it most. Inside was a single sentence in her distinctive handwriting followed by a P.S. note. The sentence read, "You were never the problem, Victoria. You were always the solution to your own life." The P.S. said, Derek's engagement to Brianna lasted 6 weeks before she cheated on him with one of his clients. Karma is real, and she's absolutely ruthless. I laughed out loud in my little apartment, not from schadenfreude exactly, though there was definitely some of that, but from the realization that Derek's life was continuing its messy trajectory while mine was genuinely improving. He'd thought he was trading up when he humiliated me in that cafe, thought Brianna was the partner who operated at his level. The fact that she destroyed him the way he destroyed me felt like the universe balancing its books, though I knew better than to take too much satisfaction in his pain. My healing couldn't be dependent on his suffering. It had to stand on its own foundation. As fall turned to winter in Charleston, I continued building my new life with intentional care. I took a watercolor class at the local arts center, rediscovering a medium I'd loved in college but had abandoned during my marriage because Derek thought hobbies were time wasters unless they advanced your career. I volunteered at a nonprofit that provided design services to small businesses owned by women and minorities, using my skills to help people who reminded me of myself before I had proper training or connections. I said yes to dates occasionally, though nothing serious, still too raw to trust my judgment about men, still learning how to be alone without being lonely. Back in Portland, Derek's life was unraveling in ways I only learned about months later through Naomi's occasional updates. The affair with Brianna had imploded spectacularly, just as his sister had mentioned, leaving Derek's reputation damaged in the business community he'd cared about so desperately. Clients who'd heard about the cafe incident through the grapevine started questioning Hayes Development Corporation's integrity, drawing uncomfortable parallels between how Derek treated his wife and how he might treat business partners. His father Richard, who'd built the company on relationship and trust, was reportedly furious about the reputational damage Derek had caused. More significantly, Trevor Moss and Kyle Brennan, the friends who'd laughed when Derek called me stupid, had started distancing themselves after their own wives heard the story and expressed disgust at their participation. Ethan Park, the one who'd looked uncomfortable during the whole cafe scene, had actually reached out to Naomi to apologize for not speaking up, admitting he'd been a coward but that witnessing Derek's cruelty had made him reevaluate some of his own relationship patterns. The social circle Derek had performed for was fracturing, and he was increasingly isolated in the life he'd thought would be so much better without me holding him back. I listened to these updates with detached interest, like hearing about characters in a television show I used to watch but had stopped following. Derek's struggles didn't bring me the satisfaction I might have expected. Instead, they just confirmed what I'd already concluded. He'd been a small man trying to feel big by making others small, and that approach eventually collapsed under its own miserable weight. My life was moving forward while his was stagnating, and that was justice enough. By the time I'd been in Charleston for 8 months, I'd been promoted to creative director at Magnolia, overseeing brand strategy for the studio's largest clients. The healthcare rebrand I'd led had won a regional design award and been featured in industry publications. I'd developed a reputation in Charleston's creative community as someone who combined strategic thinking with emotional intelligence, who understood that effective branding was about authentic storytelling rather than surface aesthetics. I was being invited to speak on panels, to mentor emerging designers, to contribute my expertise to projects that actually mattered. And then I met Adrian Whitmore on a Tuesday evening in March at a gallery opening I almost didn't attend. I'd been working late on a pitch deck, was tired and ready to go home to my apartment and the novel I was halfway through. But Kat had insisted, practically dragging me out of the studio with promises that the artist was brilliant and the wine would be decent and I needed to stop using work as an excuse to avoid having a life. So I went, wearing jeans and a blazer, no makeup beyond mascara, not trying to impress anyone because I'd stopped performing for male attention months ago. The gallery was in a converted church in the French Quarter, all soaring ceilings and dramatic lighting that showcased contemporary art in conversation with historic architecture. I was studying a mixed media piece that incorporated vintage maps and embroidery when a voice beside me said, "The artist told me she's trying to capture the tension between where we've been and where we're going." Appropriately metaphorical for a building that used to save souls and now sells art. I turned to find a man about my age, maybe slightly older, with warm brown eyes and an easy smile that didn't feel practiced or predatory. He was tall without being imposing, dressed casually but well, holding a wine glass like someone who actually appreciated wine rather than using it as a prop. "I'm Adrian," he said, extending his free hand. "I own this gallery, which sounds more impressive than it is since I also clean the bathrooms and argue with the alarm system when it decides 3 a.m. is a great time to malfunction." His self-deprecating humor was so different from Derek's constant self-promotion that I found myself smiling genuinely for the first time in hours. "Victoria," I replied, shaking his hand. "I appreciate an honest gallery owner. Most of them act like they're doing artists a favor by existing." He laughed, a real sound rather than a calculated response. "You've clearly met some of the same gallery owners I have. Let me guess, you're an artist yourself?" "Designer actually," I said. "Brand strategy and visual identity, mostly for businesses rather than galleries, though I appreciate good art when I see it. We talked for over an hour that evening, conversation flowing easily between art and business and the peculiar challenge of making creative work financially sustainable. Adrian had opened the gallery 3 years earlier after spending a decade working in New York's art world, growing disillusioned with the commercial pressures that turned art into investment commodities rather than meaningful cultural expressions. He'd chosen Charleston for the same reasons I had, wanting a place with history and beauty where he could build something authentic without the crushing overhead and pretension of larger markets. What struck me most about Adrian was how he asked questions and actually listened to the answers, not just waiting for his turn to talk but genuinely interested in understanding my perspective. When I mentioned my work at Magnolia Creative, he didn't immediately start explaining how he could be a valuable connection or how his understanding of visual culture was relevant to my field. He just asked what drew me to brand strategy, what I found most challenging about the work, whether I still made art for myself or if the commercial aspect had consumed that impulse entirely. His curiosity felt respectful rather than interrogative, like he was trying to understand me as a person rather than categorize me as a potential asset or threat. Before the evening ended, Adrian mentioned he was looking for someone to help develop a cohesive visual identity for the gallery itself, something that would work across promotional materials, website, signage, social media. We've been operating with whatever looks okay at the moment, he admitted with a self-conscious laugh, but I'm realizing that's not sustainable as we grow. I don't suppose you'd be interested in taking on a project like that? The question was asked without pressure, genuinely offering an opportunity rather than testing whether I was competent enough to deserve one. I found myself saying yes before I'd fully considered the implications, drawn by his authenticity and the creative challenge of developing identity for a space dedicated to showcasing other people's creative expression. Our professional relationship began the following week when I visited the gallery during daytime hours to assess the space and discuss Adrian's vision. He wanted something that honored Charleston's historic character without feeling stuffy or exclusive, that communicated serious appreciation for contemporary art without alienating people who felt intimidated by gallery culture. As he talked, I took notes and photographs, already envisioning color palettes and typography that could bridge traditional and modern, accessible and sophisticated. What became clear during that initial consultation was that Adrian's values aligned almost perfectly with my own design philosophy. The belief that good work should invite people in rather than keep them out, should communicate honestly rather than obscure meaning behind pretentious aesthetics. The gallery project consumed my evenings and weekends for the next month, though it never felt like burden. I developed mood boards that captured Adrian's vision, created logo concepts that referenced Charleston's architectural details while feeling contemporary, designed templates for promotional materials that could be adapted for different exhibitions. Adrian was the ideal client, clear about what he wanted but open to professional guidance, appreciative of the work without being effusive, willing to invest in quality because he understood that good design was infrastructure rather than decoration. Working with him reminded me why I'd fallen in love with this field originally, the collaborative process of translating someone's vision into visual form, the satisfaction of solving complex communication problems through color and composition and carefully chosen words. We presented the final identity package on a warm April evening, just the two of us in the gallery after hours. I'd prepared a full presentation deck walking through the strategic rationale behind every decision, but Adrian stopped me halfway through. "Victoria, this is remarkable," he said quietly, studying the logo variations displayed on my laptop screen. "It's exactly what I wanted but didn't know how to articulate. You've managed to make the gallery feel both serious and welcoming, which is the hardest balance to achieve in this world." His genuine appreciation, the specific feedback that proved he'd actually engaged with the work rather than just glancing at pretty pictures, meant more to me than any compliment Derek had ever paid me. After we finished the presentation, Adrian suggested dinner at a nearby restaurant to celebrate the project completion. It felt natural rather than awkward, two people who'd worked well together extending the evening because neither was quite ready for it to end. Over pasta and wine that was legitimately good rather than just expensive, our conversation drifted from professional topics to personal ones. Adrian told me about his marriage that had ended 5 years earlier, a relationship that had slowly suffocated under the weight of incompatible life goals and his ex-wife's resentment of the financial instability that came with pursuing gallery ownership. She wanted security and suburban comfort, he explained, swirling wine in his glass. I wanted to take risks on artists nobody had heard of yet. Neither of us was wrong, but we definitely weren't right for each other. I found myself sharing my own story, not the full devastating version but more than I'd told anyone in Charleston. I'd been married too, I said, measuring my words carefully. It ended badly about a year ago. He made me feel like I wasn't smart enough, wasn't successful enough, wasn't enough in general. It took me a long time to realize that the problem wasn't my inadequacy but his need to feel superior. Adrian's expression shifted to something that looked like anger on my behalf, though his voice stayed gentle. He was wrong about you, he said simply. I've worked with dozens of designers over the years, and your strategic thinking is exceptional. Anyone who couldn't see that was protecting their own insecurity. The validation from someone whose judgment I'd come to respect settled something inside me, another small piece of healing clicking into place. Our friendship evolved naturally into something more over the following weeks. Adrian invited me to exhibition openings where he introduced me to artists and collectors with genuine pride rather than using me as arm decoration. I brought him to Magnolia creative events where my co-workers immediately approved of him, later telling me he was a substantial upgrade from whatever I'd had before. We took long walks through historic neighborhoods, discussing everything from city development politics to whether abstract expressionism still had cultural relevance to our shared complicated relationships with ambition. He never pushed for more than I was ready to give, content to let our relationship develop at whatever pace felt comfortable. The shift from friendship to romance happened on an evening in late May when Adrian invited me to a private preview of his next exhibition, a solo show by a Charleston-based painter whose work explored themes of displacement and belonging. The paintings were stunning, layered, and complex, speaking to the experience of building new identity after everything familiar falls away. I stood in front of a particularly powerful piece depicting a woman walking away from a burning house toward an uncertain horizon, and something about it cracked open the careful composure I'd maintained for months. Adrian found me with tears running down my face, and instead of asking what was wrong or trying to fix my emotions, he just stood beside me in silent companionship until I was ready to speak. That painting is my last year, I said finally, my voice rough. Everything burning behind me, not knowing what's ahead, just walking because staying would mean being consumed by the fire. Adrian nodded slowly, understanding. And now? He asked. Where are you now in that metaphor? I studied the painting again, the woman's posture suggesting determination rather than defeat, the horizon line promising possibility rather than emptiness. Now I think I'm past the worst of it, I said. Still walking, but the smoke is starting to clear. I can almost see what's ahead. Adrian took my hand, the gesture tentative enough that I could have pulled away but I didn't want to. When you're ready, he said quietly, I'd like to be part of what's ahead. Not to rescue you or complete you or any of that nonsense, just to walk alongside you if you'll have me. I kissed him then, in his gallery surrounded by paintings about displacement and new beginnings, and it felt nothing like kissing Derek had felt. There was no performance anxiety, no mental checklist of whether I was doing it right, no voice in my head analyzing whether this would lead to criticism later. There was just the simple human comfort of being seen and valued by someone who asked for nothing except my authentic self. We left the gallery and went back to my apartment, and what happened there was gentle and unhurried and so different from the mechanical intimacy my marriage had devolved into that I cried again afterward, though this time from relief rather than grief. Adrian and I became inseparable over the summer months, though we maintained enough independence that the relationship never felt suffocating. He had his gallery obligations and artist relationships that demanded attention. I had my client projects at Magnolia and the growing reputation that was leading to speaking invitations and consulting opportunities. We'd spend evenings together cooking elaborate meals in my small kitchen or his slightly larger one, weekends exploring the low country beaches or day tripping to Savannah, quiet mornings reading in companionable silence before starting our separate workdays. He met the version of me that had emerged from the ashes of my marriage, and he loved that version without needing to change or improve or correct anything about who I was. The only shadow over my Charleston happiness was the occasional message from Naomi updating me on Derek's continued unraveling back in Portland. His professional reputation had taken serious hits after several clients left Hayes Development Corporation, citing concerns about integrity and judgment. His father Richard had apparently forced him into a reduced role at the family company, bringing in outside management to repair relationships Derek had damaged. The social circle he'd valued so highly had largely abandoned him once it became clear that Derek's pattern of behavior extended beyond just how he'd treated me. Naomi reported all this with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness, pleased that her brother was facing consequences but grieving the relationship they'd once had before his ego consumed his better qualities. I should have felt vindicated hearing about Derek's professional and social decline, and part of me did experience grim satisfaction that the universe had delivered its own justice. But mostly I just felt distant from it all, like hearing about someone I'd known in another lifetime rather than the man I'd been married to just over a year earlier. My life had moved so far beyond Derek Hayes that his struggles barely registered as relevant to my present reality. I was building something genuine in Charleston while he was experiencing the natural consequences of treating people as disposable once they no longer served his needs. Our trajectories had diverged completely, and I was profoundly grateful for that divergence. In September, exactly 1 year after I'd led that first major presentation for the healthcare network, Diane called me into her office with news that would change everything again. "Victoria, I need to tell you something that's going to sound absurd," she said, her expression caught between excitement and concern. "I've been offered a position leading the design division at a major firm in Atlanta. It's an incredible opportunity, the kind that doesn't come along often. But it means I'll be leaving Magnolia, and I want you to buy the studio." The proposition knocked the air from my lungs. "Buy the studio?" I repeated stupidly. "Diane, I don't have that kind of capital. I'm still rebuilding after my divorce." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "I've run the numbers with my accountant. The studio is profitable and has strong client relationships. Any bank would finance this purchase based on the business fundamentals alone. But more than that, you're the right person to lead Magnolia into its next phase. The team respects you, clients specifically request you, and you have the strategic vision to grow this beyond what I built." She slid a folder across her desk. "Just look at the proposal. Talk to Adrian, talk to a financial advisor, think about whether you want to be working for someone else 10 years from now or building something that's entirely yours." I took the folder home that evening, my mind spinning with possibility and terror in equal measure. Adrian found me at my kitchen table hours later, surrounded by financial projections and business plans, chewing my thumbnail in anxious concentration. "Talk to me," he said gently, pulling up a chair beside me. "What's happening in that brilliant head of yours?" I explained Diane's offer, the opportunity and the risk, my excitement warring with deeply ingrained fear of failure. "What if I can't do it?" I asked, voicing the doubt that had been circling since Diane first mentioned the idea. "What if I buy the studio and run it into the ground? What if I'm not actually capable of this level of leadership?" Adrian was quiet for a long moment, studying my face with that thoughtful expression I'd come to know well. "Can I tell you what I see?" he asked finally. "I see someone who rebuilt her entire life from nothing in just over a year. Who moved across the country alone and established herself in a new market through pure talent and work ethic. Who leads teams and wins major clients and gets promoted based on merit. The only person who still thinks you might not be capable of extraordinary things is you, and that's just the voice of someone who spent years telling you lies." He took my hand. "I can't tell you what decision to make, but I can tell you that you're one of the most competent people I've ever met. If you want this, you can absolutely do this." I spent the next 2 weeks conducting due diligence that would have made Patricia Chin proud, reviewing every aspect of Magnolia's operations and financials. I consulted with business advisors, talked to the studio's existing clients about their confidence in my leadership, had brutally honest conversations with the team about whether they'd stay if ownership transferred to me. Every conversation confirmed what Diane had told me from the start. The business was solid, the opportunities for growth were real, and I was the logical person to lead that growth. The only obstacle was my own lingering self-doubt, the voice that sounded suspiciously like Derek telling me I wasn't smart enough for serious business decisions. On a crisp October morning, I signed the papers that made me the owner of Magnolia Creative Studio. The purchase was financed through a small business loan that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure, but Adrian was right about one thing. I was done working for other people, done letting anyone else control my professional trajectory. This was my company now, my vision to execute, my success or failure to own completely. Diane stayed on for a month to facilitate the transition, introducing me to her network and sharing institutional knowledge that couldn't be captured in any operations manual. On her last day, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "You're going to do things with this studio I never imagined. I can't wait to watch you soar." Owning Magnolia changed everything about my relationship to my work. Suddenly every decision mattered in ways it hadn't when I was an employee. I was responsible for 12 people's livelihoods, for maintaining client relationships that generated the revenue keeping us operational, for the strategic direction that would determine whether we thrived or merely survived. The pressure was immense, but it was clean pressure, the kind that came from genuine responsibility rather than from trying to meet someone else's impossible standards while they undermined my confidence. I worked harder than I'd ever worked in my life, but I loved it in ways I hadn't loved work since before my marriage, when success felt like self-expression rather than validation seeking. Under my leadership, Magnolia began taking on more ambitious projects, the kind of comprehensive brand transformations that required months of strategic development and commanded substantial fees. I hired 2 additional designers, both women of color who reminded me of myself at their age, talented but lacking the connections that opened doors in creative industries. I implemented profit sharing for the entire team because I remembered what it felt like to work hard while someone else reaped the primary financial benefits. I turned down clients whose values didn't align with ours, even when saying no meant short-term revenue loss, because I'd learned that compromising your principles for money left you hollow regardless of how much you earned. By the following spring, Magnolia Creative Studio under my ownership had been featured in regional business publications, had won multiple industry awards, and had doubled its revenue compared to the previous year. We were developing brand identities for clients I would have considered out of reach just 2 years earlier. I was being invited to speak at design conferences, to serve on nonprofit boards, to mentor emerging creative entrepreneurs. The professional life I was building bore no resemblance to the one I'd had in Portland, where my achievements were always qualified by being Derek's wife, where my success was treated as ancillary to his more important work. Adrian proposed on a Sunday morning in June, not at a fancy restaurant or public venue but in my apartment kitchen while I was making coffee in my pajamas. We were talking about an exhibition he was planning, and he suddenly interrupted himself mid-sentence. "Marry me," he said, not as a question but as a simple statement of desire. "I want to build a life with you, Victoria. Not because I need you to complete me or because you'd look good at business functions, but because you're the most remarkable person I've ever known and I want to be part of your remarkable life." He pulled a vintage ring from his pocket, emerald surrounded by small diamonds, elegant and understated and so perfectly suited to my taste that I knew he'd paid attention to everything I'd ever said about jewelry. I said yes without hesitation, without the anxiety that had accompanied Derek's proposal years earlier. Adrian wasn't offering me access to a world I didn't belong to or promising to elevate my status through his connections. He was just offering partnership, the kind where both people brought their whole selves and neither had to diminish their light so the other could shine brighter. We decided on a small ceremony, immediate family and close friends only, something intimate and meaningful rather than the performance spectacle my first wedding had been. Adrian's parents were thrilled, warm people who reminded me of Helen in their genuine enthusiasm for their son's happiness. My own parents were gone, but Naomi immediately asked if she could stand as my family, an offer that made me cry grateful tears. The venue we chose was Heritage Art Gallery for the ceremony, followed by dinner at a historic restaurant overlooking Charleston Harbor. The date we set was early September, almost exactly 2 years after I'd arrived in Charleston with my car packed and my heart broken and no clear vision of what rebuilding might look like. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. 2 years from destruction to this moment, from being called stupid in a cafe to owning a successful business and marrying a man who saw my value without needing to diminish it. If someone had told me during those darkest days after Derek's betrayal that this life was waiting for me, I wouldn't have believed them. But here I was, proving that sometimes the best revenge is simply becoming so completely yourself that the person who tried to destroy you becomes irrelevant to your happiness. As summer progressed and wedding planning consumed whatever time wasn't devoted to running Magnolia, I felt genuinely at peace for the first time in years. Not the fragile peace that comes from avoiding difficult emotions but the solid peace that comes from building a life aligned with your actual values. I was marrying someone who respected my intelligence and celebrated my success. I owned a business that reflected my creative vision and ethical standards. I had friendships based on mutual appreciation rather than social obligation. The woman I saw in the mirror looked like someone who'd survived fire and emerged stronger, scarred maybe but not broken, capable of joy that didn't require anyone's permission or validation. I hadn't thought about Derek Hayes in months when Naomi called in mid-August with news that shifted the ground beneath my feet. "Victoria, I need to tell you something, and I don't know if it matters to you anymore, but I thought you should know," she said, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't immediately identify. "Derek is coming to Charleston. Richard insisted he attend some national commercial real estate conference happening there in September. Some kind of professional development mandate from Dad, trying to rebuild Derek's reputation by forcing him back into industry networking." She paused. "The conference ends on September 6th. Your wedding is September 7th. Those dates are close enough that Derek will probably stay through the weekend rather than flying back immediately." The coincidence was absurd enough to feel like cosmic intervention. After 2 years of carefully constructed distance, of building a life so separate from my past that it existed in a completely different universe, Derek was coming to my city during the exact weekend I was getting married. I should have been upset by the news, anxious about the possibility of running into him, worried that his presence would contaminate the joy I felt about marrying Adrian. Instead, I felt strangely calm, like the universe was offering me an opportunity one hadn't known I wanted. Not for revenge in the petty sense, but for the kind of closing that comes from demonstrating undeniably that you've not just survived but thrived. "Is he bringing anyone?" I asked Naomi, curious despite myself. She made a disgusted sound. "He's apparently dating again, some woman who works in property management, but it's early and messy and Dad told him to come alone to the conference because he needs to focus on professional rehabilitation rather than romantic drama." He paused. "Victoria, I can try to keep him away from you if you want. Make sure he doesn't find out about your wedding, keep him occupied during his visit. Just say the word." I considered her offer, imagined hiding my happiness to avoid an uncomfortable encounter, and realized I was done hiding anything about my life. "No," I said firmly. "If we run into each other, we run into each other. I'm not going to arrange my wedding around Derek's travel schedule. Besides, maybe it's time he saw exactly what I built after he tried to demolish me." Adrian noticed the shift in my mood that evening when I told him about Naomi's call. He listened carefully, his expression thoughtful rather than concerned. "How do you feel about this?" he asked when I finished explaining the situation. "I'm not threatened by your ex-husband being in town, but I want to make sure you're okay with the possibility of seeing him." I leaned against his shoulder, considering the question seriously. "Honestly, I think I'm ready for it. Not because I want to show off or make him feel bad, though I wouldn't be devastated if he felt a little bad. But because I've built something real here, and having him witness that accidentally, without me engineering the encounter, feels like the universe's way of providing closure. Does that make sense?" Adrian kissed the top of my head. "Perfect sense. You're not the same person he thought you were. You're not even the same person you were when you left Portland. If he sees you now, he'll have to confront what he threw away, and that's justice of the purest kind." We spent the evening discussing whether to adjust any wedding plans, ultimately deciding that everything should proceed exactly as scheduled. If Derek somehow discovered I was in Charleston, if he somehow learned about the wedding, if he somehow showed up, well, that would be interesting, but it wouldn't change anything about my actual happiness. My joy wasn't contingent on his absence. It existed entirely independent of Derek Hayes and his opinions, which was perhaps the greatest measure of how far I'd traveled from that morning in the cafe when his words had the power to shatter my world. The weeks before the wedding passed in a blur of final preparations and regular business operations. Magnolia had been commissioned to develop a complete brand identity for a Charleston tech startup that had just secured series of funding, the kind of high-profile project that would further establish our reputation in the industry. I was managing that alongside wedding planning, proving to myself daily that I could balance professional demands with personal joy, that success in one area didn't require sacrificing the other. Adrian was simultaneously preparing for Heritage Art Gallery's fall season, the biggest programming year he'd attempted since opening. We were both overwhelmed and energized, building our individual dreams while preparing to officially join our lives. The honeymoon was a week in Savannah, just an hour away from Charleston but feeling worlds apart with its moss-draped squares and antebellum architecture. Adrian and I had deliberately chosen somewhere close rather than exotic, wanting rest and connection more than adventure or exotic locations. We spent mornings wandering through historic districts, afternoons reading in our hotel room, evenings trying restaurants we'd researched and some we stumbled upon by accident. It was blissfully ordinary, the kind of honeymoon where the company mattered more than the destination, where we could simply exist together without performance or agenda. On our third day there, Naomi called with news she felt I needed to hear sooner rather than later. "Derek left Charleston the morning after your wedding," she said without preamble. "He didn't attend any more conference sessions, just went straight to the airport and flew home. Mom called me yesterday because she's worried about him. Apparently he's been a mess since he got back, finally confronting what he threw away." I listened while watching Adrian browse a used bookstore across the street from our hotel, the morning sun catching in his dark hair. "How do you feel about that?" I asked Naomi, genuinely curious. "He's still your brother, regardless of everything that happened." She was quiet for a moment. "Honestly? Part of me is glad he's finally facing real consequences. The emotional kind, not just professional ones. But mostly I'm just sad about all of it. Sad that he hurt you so badly. Sad that he destroyed something good because of his own insecurity. Sad that our family dynamics are permanently altered." Her honesty was refreshing, acknowledging the complexity rather than insisting I should feel vindicated or forgiving. We talked for a while longer about family dynamics and moving forward, about her own life in Portland and whether she might consider relocating to be closer to the family she'd chosen rather than the one she'd been born into. The rest of the honeymoon passed without interruption from my old life. Adrian and I talked about expanding both our businesses, his gallery potentially opening a second location in Asheville, my studio possibly bringing on associates who could eventually buy into ownership. We discussed whether we wanted children, deciding to leave that question open rather than forcing a decision. We mapped out travel we wanted to do, places we'd separately dreamed of visiting that we could now explore together. The future we planned was collaborative rather than hierarchical, both of us bringing dreams to the table and figuring out how to make space for everything that mattered. Returning to Charleston felt different as a married woman, though the change was more internal than external. I was still Victoria Hayes professionally, had decided to keep my name for business continuity since Magnolia Creative Studio was established under that identity. But I was also Victoria Whitmore in my personal life, a duality that felt appropriate for someone who'd learned to maintain clear boundaries between professional and personal identity. The team at Magnolia threw us a small celebration on our first day back, complete with champagne and a cake decorated with designs from our wedding invitations. Their genuine happiness for my happiness reminded me daily why building this business had been the right decision. The fall season at Magnolia was our busiest yet. The tech startup rebrand I'd mentioned to Derek at the cafe launched to significant industry attention, positioning us as the go-to studio for companies wanting sophisticated brand identities that spoke to both innovation and authenticity. We were fielding inquiries from potential clients in Atlanta, Charlotte, even Nashville, companies willing to work remotely with us because they'd heard about our strategic approach. I hired 2 more designers and a dedicated project manager, growing the team to 17 people, all of whom I knew by name and story, all of whom received profit sharing and genuine investment in their professional development. Adrian's gallery was experiencing parallel growth. The fall exhibition schedule included 3 shows that garnered attention from regional art publications, bringing collectors from across the Southeast to Charleston specifically to see work he'd curated. He was being courted by artists represented by larger galleries, people who appreciated his commitment to showing work with substance rather than just commercial appeal. We'd have dinner together most nights, comparing our days, celebrating wins, troubleshooting challenges, functioning as genuine partners in ways my first marriage had never approached. The life we were building felt sustainable rather than fragile, grounded in mutual respect rather than power imbalance. For months after the wedding, Helen called with unexpected news. "Victoria, I need to tell you something before you hear it through other channels," she said, her voice carrying a strange mixture of satisfaction and concern. Derek's father just forced him out of Hayes Development Corporation entirely. Not reduced responsibility this time, but completely removed from family business operations. Apparently there was some financial mismanagement, properties he'd recommended that lost money, decisions made without proper due diligence. Richard finally decided Derek was more liability than asset. The news should have pleased me more than it did. Instead, I mostly felt distant from it, like hearing about the downfall of a character in a television show I'd stopped watching. "What's Derek going to do?" I asked, more from politeness than genuine investment in his fate. Helen's tone shifted. "That's the interesting part. Naomi told me he's apparently trying to start over completely. He's leaving Portland, moving to Denver or maybe Phoenix, somewhere far from his family's business empire and social circles. Starting fresh in commercial real estate where nobody knows his history. It's almost like he's doing what you did, burning down his old life and rebuilding somewhere new." The parallel was uncomfortable to acknowledge, this idea that Derek was following a path I'd pioneered out of necessity while he was choosing it out of desperation. But I supposed everyone deserved the chance to start over, even people who'd caused the destruction they were trying to escape. "I hope it works out for him," I said, meaning it in the abstract way you hope for anyone's well-being even when their happiness or suffering no longer impacts your own life. He made terrible choices and hurt people, including me especially. But staying stuck in those choices forever helps nobody. If he can actually learn and grow and become someone better, that's probably good for everyone he'll interact with in the future. Helen made a sound of approval. "You've come so far, Victoria." The woman who left Portland couldn't have said that with such equanimity. "The woman who left Portland could barely function," I replied. "I've had good teachers and a lot of therapy and the great fortune of building something meaningful. That combination tends to give you perspective." As winter settled over Charleston, bringing the kind of mild cold that felt luxurious compared to Portland's bitter dampness, I found myself reflecting on the full arc of transformation. 2 years and 3 months from cafe humiliation to this moment, sitting in my studio after hours, reviewing proposals for projects that would carry Magnolia into another year of growth. The woman Derek had called too stupid for basic business concepts was now running a creative firm generating 7 figures in annual revenue, employing nearly 20 people, contributing to Charleston's creative economy in ways that earned respect from the broader business community. The contrast was so stark it almost felt fictional, like a revenge fantasy someone might write rather than lived experience. But it was real, documented in bank statements and client contracts and the awards accumulating on Magnolia's office walls. It was real in the team I'd built, diverse in background and united in commitment to excellent work. It was real in the marriage I was living, coming home each night to someone who asked about my day with genuine interest rather than looking for opportunities to correct my thinking. The validation I'd once desperately sought from Derek's approval I now received from my own accomplishments and from people who'd earned the right to have opinions about my work. The shift was so complete that I barely recognized the woman I'd been during my first marriage, that version of myself who'd accepted diminishment as the price of belonging. The new year brought changes I hadn't anticipated. In February, I received a call from the organizers of a national design conference asking me to deliver a keynote address about building creative businesses with sustainable growth models. The invitation was prestigious, the kind of opportunity that could establish me as a thought leader in my field beyond just the Southeast regional reputation I'd already built. Adrian encouraged me to accept, pointing out that sharing what I'd learned could help other designers avoid some of the pitfalls I'd navigated. The speech I began crafting focused on professional development and business strategy, deliberately avoiding personal narrative because my story of rebuilding after divorce felt too raw to share publicly. But as I worked on the keynote over several weeks, I kept returning to the personal elements, recognizing that the business lessons were inextricable from the life lessons. How I'd learned to value my own judgment after years of having it undermined. How I'd built a company culture based on mutual respect because I'd experienced the corrosive effects of hierarchical diminishment. How I'd made strategic decisions from a place of confidence rather than seeking external validation. The professional growth had emerged directly from personal transformation, and trying to separate them created a dishonest narrative that would serve my audience poorly. I talked to Adrian about the dilemma one evening while we cooked dinner together in his kitchen, which had become our primary residence since it was larger and better equipped than my apartment. "Do I talk about Derek?" I asked, chopping vegetables with perhaps more force than strictly necessary. "Do I explain where I was 3 years ago versus where I am now, or do I keep it professional and just focus on business principles?" He considered while stirring risotto, his movements practiced and meditative. "What would serve your audience better?" he asked. "Generic business advice they could get from any number of speakers, or your authentic story about rebuilding yourself professionally after your personal life imploded? One might be safer, but the other would actually help people." He was right, of course. The power of my story wasn't in the business tactics I'd employed but in the internal work that had made those tactics possible. Women especially, and plenty of men too, knew what it felt like to have their confidence systematically eroded by partners or employers or family members who needed them small to feel big themselves. If I could show them that rebuilding was possible, that you could go from broken to thriving, that success achieved through authentic self-worth was not only possible but actually more sustainable than success built on external validation, that knowledge could change trajectories. My discomfort with public vulnerability was less important than the potential impact. The keynote became a careful balance of personal narrative and professional insight, explaining how I'd rebuilt both my self-concept and my business after a devastating divorce. I didn't name Derek or provide gratuitous details about the cafe humiliation, but I was honest about having been in a marriage where my intelligence and professional accomplishments were constantly questioned, where I'd internalized doubt that had nearly destroyed my career momentum. I talked about the decision to move across the country, to start over in a new market, to eventually buy my own business. I shared specific strategies about building company culture, developing client relationships, managing growth, all of it grounded in the philosophical foundation that respecting yourself made it possible to build something worthy of respect. The conference was in Austin in late March, a massive gathering of designers and creative professionals from across the country. I was nervous in ways I hadn't been nervous since that first major presentation to the healthcare network, aware that my words would reach far beyond the immediate audience through recorded video and social media sharing. Adrian had wanted to come for support, but I'd asked him to stay in Charleston, needing to do this alone as a measure of how far I'd traveled. Helen flew down from Portland though, sitting in the front row with an expression of fierce maternal pride that steadied me when I walked onto the stage. The keynote lasted 45 minutes, my voice carrying through the hotel ballroom to an audience of nearly 800 people. I watched faces in the crowd, saw recognition and emotion ripple through the room as I described the experience of rebuilding confidence after it had been systematically dismantled. During the section about buying Magnolia, taking on debt and responsibility when part of me still believed I wasn't smart enough for business ownership, I saw several people openly crying. The standing ovation when I finished was extended and genuine, people on their feet not just out of politeness but because something I'd said had reached them in vulnerable places. The question and answer session afterward was supposed to last 15 minutes but extended to nearly 40 because people kept raising hands, wanting to share their own stories of rebuilding, asking specific questions about navigating self-doubt while making strategic decisions. A young designer asked how I'd known when I was ready to buy my own business versus when I was just running from my old life. An older woman asked how I developed the discernment to recognize when criticism was valid versus when it was someone else's insecurity being projected onto me. A man in his 50s asked about rebuilding professional reputation after personal scandal had damaged his standing in his previous market. Every question revealed how universal these experiences were. How many people were carrying wounds from relationships or situations that had convinced them they were less capable than they actually were. After the formal session ended, people lined up to speak with me privately, to share their stories, to ask for advice about their specific situations. I stood in that hotel ballroom for 2 hours, listening and responding and offering what insight I could, recognizing myself in so many of their narratives. This designer whose partner constantly critiqued her work until she'd lost confidence in her own judgment. That business owner whose family insisted he was irresponsible for pursuing creative work instead of traditional employment. Another woman who'd left a toxic agency environment where her male colleagues took credit for her ideas. The variations were endless but the core wound was the same, the experience of being made small by people who should have helped them grow. Helen waited patiently through all of it, finally pulling me away when the conference organizers needed to reset the ballroom for the next session. We went to the hotel bar, ordered expensive cocktails, and sat in silence for several minutes while I processed what had just happened. "That was extraordinary, Victoria," Helen said finally. "You gave those people permission to believe in themselves again. That's worth more than any design technique or business strategy you could have taught them." I felt raw and exposed and strangely exhilarated, like I'd just completed some emotional marathon I hadn't known I was training for. I didn't expect it to feel so intense, I admitted. Talking about Derek and the divorce and all of it in front of hundreds of people. But it also felt necessary somehow, like I couldn't fully own my success until I'd acknowledged where I'd come from. The keynote video was posted online within days, racking up views and shares that shocked me. Design publications featured excerpts. Business podcasts requested interviews. I received dozens of emails from people who'd watched the recording and wanted to share how it had impacted them, designers who'd been in abusive relationships, business owners recovering from partnership betrayals, people who'd thought their past failures disqualified them from future success. The response was overwhelming and humbling, forcing me to recognize that my story had value beyond my own healing, that the vulnerability I'd been afraid to show had created connection and possibility for others. 3 weeks after the conference, I received an email that stopped me cold. The sender was Trevor Moss, one of Derek's friends who'd laughed when he called me stupid in that Portland cafe 3 years earlier. The subject line read simply, "An overdue apology." I stared at it for several minutes before opening, uncertain whether I wanted to engage with anyone from that chapter of my life. But curiosity won out, and I clicked. "Victoria," the email began, "I watched your keynote from the Austin Design Conference. Someone shared it in a business group I'm part of, and I didn't realize it was you until you started talking about your divorce. I need to apologize for my behavior that day at the Brew Haven. I laughed when Derek called you stupid, participated in your humiliation, acted like the whole situation was entertaining rather than cruel. I've thought about that day many times over the past few years, felt sick about my participation, but didn't reach out because I figured you'd understandably want nothing to do with anyone from that period of your life." The email continued for several paragraphs, Trevor explaining that his own marriage had ended a year earlier under circumstances that made him recognize patterns he'd enabled in Derek's behavior. He'd started therapy, was working on understanding why he'd found male bonding through cruelty acceptable, was trying to be a better person for his daughters who were watching how he treated women. He wasn't asking for forgiveness or even a response, just wanted me to know that he recognized his actions had been wrong and that seeing what I'd built after everything we'd put you through had forced him to confront his own character failures. I read the email 3 times, emotional responses shifting with each reading. Anger that it had taken 3 years and a viral keynote for him to apologize. Appreciation that he'd done the internal work to recognize his complicity. Sadness that male growth so often came at the cost of women's pain. Satisfaction that my success had forced accountability from people who'd participated in my humiliation. I didn't respond immediately, needed time to consider whether engagement would serve me or just reopen wounds that had finally healed over. That evening, I showed the email to Adrian, asking his perspective on whether I should respond. He read it carefully, his expression thoughtful. "This isn't about what you owe him," he said finally. "It's about what serves you. If responding would give you closure or satisfaction or anything positive, then do it. If it would just drain your energy engaging with your past, then delete it and move forward. You don't owe anyone your emotional labor, even people trying to make amends." His framing helped clarify my thinking. I didn't owe Trevor a response, but I also recognized that his apology represented something larger than just our individual interaction. It was evidence that the work of speaking honestly about experiences like mine could shift behavior, could make people confront their complicity in casual cruelty. I drafted a brief response. "Trevor, I appreciate you taking accountability for your actions that day. It takes courage to confront your own behavior and recognize harm you've caused. I hope your daughters benefit from the growth you're doing. I've built a good life since then, as you saw in the keynote. What happened at that cafe doesn't define me anymore, though it certainly shaped my trajectory. I wish you well in your continued personal development." The response was professional and boundaried, acknowledging his apology without inviting further contact, offering basic human kindness without suggesting forgiveness he hadn't explicitly requested. I sent it and then deliberately put the entire interaction out of my mind, refusing to let it occupy mental space that could be better used elsewhere. Spring in Charleston was magnificent that year, the city exploding with azaleas and wisteria, warm enough for evening walks but not yet oppressively humid. Magnolia Creative was finalizing contracts for our largest project yet, a complete brand overhaul for a regional hospital system that would keep the entire team busy through the summer. Adrian's gallery had been selected to participate in a prestigious art fair, giving him national exposure for the artists he represented. We were both stretched thin professionally but energized rather than depleted, the kind of busy that came from meaningful work rather than obligation or desperation. In May, Naomi called with news that Derek had indeed relocated to Denver and was working for a small commercial real estate firm, starting at a junior level despite his experience because his reputation had preceded him even to a new market. She'd spoken to him recently, reported that he seemed genuinely humbled, attending therapy regularly, making different choices about how he engaged with colleagues and clients. He'd asked about me, whether I was doing well, and Naomi had shown him my conference keynote video. His response had apparently been to watch it 3 times and then sit in silence for an hour, finally acknowledging to his sister that he'd destroyed the best thing that had ever happened to him through his own arrogance and insecurity. "How does that make you feel?" Naomi asked carefully. "Knowing he finally understands what he lost, that he's genuinely trying to change?" I considered the question while watching sailboats drift across Charleston Harbor from my office window, the late afternoon sun turning the water golden. "Honestly, I'm glad he's doing the work to become better," I said slowly. "Not for my sake, because his growth or lack of it doesn't affect my life anymore. But for whoever he dates next, for his future colleagues, for everyone he'll interact with going forward. The world needs fewer people who make themselves big by making others small. If Derek can actually transform into someone who builds others up instead of tearing them down, that's a net positive for humanity even if it comes too late to repair what he broke with me." Naomi was quiet for a moment. "You're incredibly generous with your perspective," she said finally. "I don't know if I could be that balanced about someone who'd hurt me the way Derek hurt you." I laughed, the sound carrying equal parts amusement and hard-won wisdom. "It's not generosity, Naomi. It's self-preservation. Carrying anger and bitterness takes energy I'd rather spend on my business, my marriage, my actual life. Derek gets to live in my past, which is exactly where he belongs. What he does with his future is his responsibility, not my concern." We talked for a while longer about her own life, potential career moves she was considering, whether she might finally take that extended European trip she'd been planning for years. The conversation was easy and warm, the kind you have with family who've earned that designation through choice rather than obligation. Summer brought intense heat and equally intense professional satisfaction. The hospital system rebrand I'd mentioned earlier launched in June with a coordinated campaign across print, digital, environmental and broadcast media. The response exceeded even our ambitious projections, with patient satisfaction surveys showing immediate improvement in perceptions of the organization's approachability and innovation. The client was thrilled, we received industry recognition, and most importantly, the work genuinely served the community by making healthcare feel less intimidating and more human. Magnolia's reputation was solidifying not just as designers who made things look good but as strategic partners who understood how visual identity could transform organizational culture and public perception. Adrian and I celebrated our first wedding anniversary in September with a quiet dinner at the same restaurant where we'd held our reception, sitting at the same table where we'd cut our cake a year earlier. We toasted to surviving Derek's dramatic appearance at our ceremony, to the businesses we'd each grown, to the life we were building that felt more solid with each passing month. "You know what I realized today?" Adrian said as we lingered over dessert, neither of us ready for the evening to end. "This past year has been the happiest of my entire life. Not because everything was perfect or easy, but because I got to spend it with someone who's genuinely herself. No performance, no pretense, just you being exactly who you are." His words settled into my chest, warm and affirming in ways I'd stopped believing were possible during my first marriage. "I feel the same way," I replied, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You've never asked me to be smaller or different or more convenient. You've celebrated every success without feeling threatened. You've supported every risk without trying to control the outcome. That's the rarest kind of love, the kind that makes you more yourself rather than less." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the restaurant humming with other diners' conversations around us, the Charleston evening thick with humidity and possibility. "Whatever chaos brought us together, I'm grateful for all of it," I added. "Even the painful parts, because they led me here." October brought an invitation I hadn't expected. The Portland Business Association was hosting a conference on entrepreneurship and wanted me to participate in a panel discussion about building creative businesses in secondary markets. The invitation came through Helen, who was helping organize the event and had suggested me as a panelist. I stared at the email for a long time, trying to untangle my emotions about returning to Portland even briefly. I'd left that city in pieces, fled across the country to escape the wreckage of my marriage and career. The idea of going back as a successful business owner, speaking with authority about the very things Derek had insisted I didn't understand, felt both vindicating and terrifying. "What do you think?" I asked Adrian that evening, showing him the invitation on my laptop. Part of me wants to go back and show everyone who knew me as Derek's stupid ex-wife that I actually built something significant. But another part thinks that's ego talking and I should just decline gracefully. Adrian studied the invitation carefully. "Are you afraid of going back?" he asked. "Or are you afraid of how good it might feel to go back successful?" His question cut through my ambivalence with uncomfortable precision. I was afraid of both things, afraid of the vulnerability of returning to the site of my greatest humiliation and afraid of discovering I still needed validation from people whose opinions shouldn't matter anymore. "I think you should go," Adrian continued. "Not to prove anything to anyone, but because you have genuine expertise that would benefit the audience. The fact that some people there might remember you as Derek's ex-wife is irrelevant to your actual qualifications. You've built a thriving business, you employ nearly 20 people, you've won industry awards, you've delivered keynotes at national conferences. You're not going back as someone trying to prove her worth. You're going back as someone whose worth is self-evident, and some people will just happen to have the context to understand how far you've traveled." His logic was sound, stripping away the emotional complications to focus on the professional reality. I was qualified for this panel. My personal history in Portland didn't diminish my expertise. If anything, it added depth to my perspective on rebuilding after setbacks. I accepted the invitation, and then I immediately started overthinking every aspect of the trip. What I would wear, what I would say, whether I'd run into Derek or any of his remaining friends, how I'd handle questions about why I'd left Portland or what had precipitated my move to Charleston. Adrian listened patiently to my spiraling anxiety, finally taking my face in his hands and making me look at him directly. "Victoria, you're one of the most competent people I know. You run a successful business, you've delivered presentations to audiences of hundreds, you've rebuilt your entire life from nothing. A panel discussion in a city where you used to live is not going to break you. The worst that can happen is you see some people who remember your divorce, and so what? Your divorce doesn't define you anymore. Your success does." The conference was scheduled for early November. I flew into Portland on a gray Thursday morning, the familiar drizzle coating everything with the moisture I'd forgotten about during Charleston's drier weather. Helen picked me up from the airport, pulling me into a fierce hug before I'd even fully exited the terminal. "Look at you," she said, holding me at arm's length to study my face. "You're glowing, Victoria. Charleston and Adrian and that business of yours have been very good to you." We drove through the city, and I watched familiar landmarks pass with the strange detachment of someone revisiting a place they used to call home but no longer recognized as theirs. The coffee shop where Caleb had first kissed me was now a boutique selling artisanal candles. The restaurant where Derek and I had celebrated my promotion to executive chef was advertising new ownership. Even the physical landscape had moved on, the city continuing its evolution without me. Helen had insisted I stay at her house rather than a hotel, and I'd agreed because her guest room felt safer than wandering around downtown Portland alone with my memories. We spent Thursday evening catching up properly, her telling me about Cascade Marketing's continued growth, me sharing stories about Magnolia's latest projects and Adrian's gallery success. She asked if I was nervous about the panel, and I admitted I was more nervous about the possibility of running into people from my old life than about the actual presentation. "Derek's not in town," Helen said firmly. "I checked with Naomi. He's in Denver for some training program his new firm requires. And honestly, most of his old social circle has scattered or moved on. The Portland business community is large enough that you probably won't see anyone who even knows about your marriage." The conference began Friday morning at a downtown hotel I'd been to numerous times during my years at Cascade Marketing. Walking into the building triggered a flood of memories, professional events I'd attended as Derek's +1, networking mixers where I'd tried to make connections while managing his need to be the center of attention, all the ways I'd contorted myself to fit into his world. But I wasn't that woman anymore, and I wasn't here as anyone's +1. I was Victoria Hayes, owner of Magnolia Creative Studio, panelist invited for my expertise, someone who'd earned her seat at this table through her own merit. The entrepreneurship panel was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, giving me the morning to attend other sessions and reconnect with people I'd known during my Portland years. I ran into former colleagues from Cascade Marketing, all of whom were genuinely excited to see me and hear about my Charleston success. I spoke with designers I'd met at various industry events, people who remembered my work positively and were impressed by what I'd built at Magnolia. Several people mentioned having seen my Austin conference keynote, telling me how much it had resonated with them. By the time the panel started, I felt grounded in my actual identity rather than haunted by my past. The panel included 4 entrepreneurs discussing different aspects of building businesses in markets outside major metropolitan areas. I was the only creative industry representative, joined by a tech startup founder, a sustainable agriculture entrepreneur, and a woman who'd built a successful consulting practice. The moderator was skilled at drawing out interesting insights, asking questions that went beyond surface-level business advice to explore the emotional and psychological dimensions of entrepreneurship. When she asked about overcoming self-doubt during the early stages of business ownership, I found myself speaking honestly about having bought Magnolia while still recovering from a divorce that had shattered my confidence in my own judgment. I didn't name Derek or provide specific details about our marriage, but I was candid about the experience of building a business while simultaneously rebuilding your sense of self-worth, about making high-stakes decisions when part of you still believed you weren't smart enough for serious responsibility. The audience response was immediate and visceral, people leaning forward in their seats, several nodding in recognition. During the question period, a young woman asked how I'd known I was ready to take on business ownership versus when I was just compensating for personal pain with professional ambition. "It's not an either-or situation," I replied. I was absolutely compensating for personal pain, and I was also genuinely ready for the challenge. Sometimes the motivation that drives us to take risks comes from difficult places, and that doesn't make the risks any less valid or the success any less real. After the panel concluded, I was surrounded by audience members wanting to continue the conversation, to share their own stories, to ask for specific advice about their situations. I stood in that hotel conference room for over an hour, listening and responding and recognizing once again how universal these experiences were. This person struggling to leave a partnership where their contributions weren't valued. That person rebuilding after a business failure that had devastated their confidence. Another person trying to start over in a new market where they had no established reputation. Every story was different in its details but similar in its core challenge, the work of believing in yourself when circumstances have given you every reason to doubt. When the crowd finally thinned, Helen appeared at my elbow. "There's someone who'd like to speak with you," she said quietly, her expression cautious. I followed her gaze to see Richard Hayes, Derek's father, standing near the back of the room. He was older than I remembered, his hair fully silver now, his posture less commanding than it had been during my marriage to his son. But his eyes were sharp and clear, and when they met mine, I saw something that looked like respect rather than the polite tolerance he'd shown me during my years as his daughter-in-law. "Victoria," he said as I approached, extending his hand formally. "I hope I'm not intruding. I was attending the conference for other sessions and saw your name on the panel roster. I wanted to hear what you had to say." We shook hands, the gesture carrying weight beyond simple greeting. "It's good to see you, Mr. Hayes," I said, meaning it more than I'd expected. "How have you been?" He smiled, the expression tinged with sadness. "Older and hopefully wiser. I owe you an apology, Victoria. I should have intervened more actively when Derek was treating you poorly during your marriage. I saw the signs, noticed how he diminished your accomplishments, but I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere in my son's relationship. I was wrong. You deserved better from all of us." The apology caught me off guard, this powerful man who'd built a real estate empire acknowledging his failure to protect someone he'd claimed to view as family. "I appreciate you saying that," I replied carefully. "Though I'm not sure there was much you could have done. Derek made his choices, and I made mine by staying as long as I did. We all had our roles in how things unfolded. Richard nodded slowly. Perhaps. But I want you to know that watching what you've built since leaving Portland, hearing you speak today with such clarity and confidence, has been a lesson in resilience I won't forget. Derek destroyed something precious because he couldn't handle someone else being talented and successful. That's entirely on him, and he's paying the price for it. You, on the other hand, have proven that his assessment of your capabilities was always more about his insecurity than your actual limitations. We talked for a while longer, Richard sharing updates about Hayes Development Corporation's restructuring and his own partial retirement, me offering general information about Magnolia's growth without feeling the need to impress or justify myself. The conversation was easier than I'd anticipated, free from the tension that had always existed when I was married to his son and trying to meet unspoken family expectations. Before he left, Richard handed me his business card. If you ever need anything, professional or otherwise, please don't hesitate to reach out. You're an impressive woman, Victoria, and I'm sorry my family didn't recognize that sooner. That evening, Helen hosted a small dinner party at her house, inviting several people from my Portland years who'd stayed in touch or wanted to reconnect. Naomi drove up from Eugene where she'd relocated for a new job, bringing her girlfriend who I immediately liked. Several former Cascade marketing colleagues attended, people who'd been genuinely supportive during my divorce and were happy to see me thriving. The evening was warm and nostalgic without being painful, everyone focused on present and future rather than dwelling on past difficulties. When Naomi toasted to second chances and well-deserved success, I felt genuinely grateful for how things had unfolded, for the disaster that had pushed me toward a life I would never have chosen but that fit me better than anything I'd planned. I flew back to Charleston Saturday afternoon, exhausted but satisfied by the Portland trip. Adrian picked me up from the airport, and I talked nonstop during the drive home, processing everything that had happened, marveling at how returning to the site of my greatest humiliation had felt powerful rather than threatening. You faced your past and it didn't devour you, Adrian observed. In fact, it sounds like your past barely recognized you because you'd become someone so completely different from who you were back then. His assessment was accurate. The woman who'd left Portland 3 years ago had been broken and uncertain, fleeing a life that had become uninhabitable. The woman who'd just returned was confident and successful, visiting briefly out of professional obligation rather than emotional need. The holiday season that year was the first I'd experienced as a married woman in a healthy relationship, and the contrast to previous years was striking. Adrian and I hosted Thanksgiving at his house, inviting friends who'd become chosen family, cooking together in his spacious kitchen, creating traditions that belonged to us rather than inherited expectations from either of our families. Naomi flew down with her girlfriend, staying for a long weekend that felt easy and joyful. We went to gallery openings and design exhibitions, took long walks through historic neighborhoods decorated for the season, stayed up late talking about everything and nothing. The happiness I felt was uncomplicated, not contingent on anyone's approval or dependent on external validation. It just was, solid and real and entirely my own. In early December, I received an unexpected email from Derek. The subject line read, "No response needed," and I almost deleted it without opening. But curiosity and a sense that I'd come far enough to handle whatever he might say made me click. Victoria, the email began, I know I have no right to contact you, and I want to be clear up front that I'm not asking for anything from you. Not forgiveness, not absolution, not even acknowledgement. I'm writing because my therapist suggested that part of my accountability process should include directly acknowledging harm I've caused without making it the other person's responsibility to make me feel better about it. The email continued for several paragraphs, Derek explaining the work he'd been doing in therapy to understand why he'd needed to diminish me to feel secure, how his own father's conditional approval had created patterns where he could only feel valuable by being superior to those around him, the ways he'd sabotaged his own life through the same arrogance that had destroyed our marriage. He acknowledged the cafe incident specifically, the cruelty of calling me stupid in front of his friends, the cowardice of ending our marriage through public humiliation rather than honest private conversation. He talked about watching my conference keynote multiple times, recognizing himself in my descriptions of partners who made themselves big by making others small, sitting with the shame of knowing he'd been that person. I saw you speak at the Portland conference last month, he wrote. I wasn't supposed to be there, was in Denver, but my firm sent me back for some client meetings that coincided with the event. I attended your panel because I wanted to see who you'd become without me, and Victoria, you were remarkable. Articulate and insightful and so clearly comfortable in your own expertise. Everything I told you that you weren't. I sat in that audience and understood viscerally what I'd thrown away, not because I still have romantic feelings for you but because I destroyed something genuinely valuable through my own insecurity. The life you've built in Charleston, the business you own, the respect you've earned in your industry, all of it is proof that my assessment of your capabilities was always a lie I told to protect my fragile ego. The email concluded with a reiteration that he didn't expect or want a response, that he was sharing this purely as part of his own accountability work, that he wished me continued success and happiness. I read it 3 times, emotional responses shifting with each pass. There was satisfaction in his acknowledgement, vindication in his recognition of how wrong he'd been about my capabilities. There was also a strange sadness for the person he'd been and the pain he'd caused both of us through his inability to handle his own insecurity. But mostly there was just distance, a sense that this chapter of my life was so completely closed that even his most heartfelt apology couldn't reopen it. I showed the email to Adrian that evening. He read it carefully, then looked at me with gentle curiosity. "How does this land for you?" he asked. "Does it give you anything you needed, or is it just him processing his own guilt?" I considered the question seriously. "It's mostly him processing his guilt," I said slowly. "But that's okay. I don't need anything from Derek anymore. Not apologies, not acknowledgement, not validation of my worth. I have all of that from myself and from the life I've built. His email is just confirmation that the person who hurt me recognizes the harm he caused, and that's worth something even if it doesn't change anything for me personally." Adrian kissed my forehead. "You're remarkably healthy about all of this. I'm not sure I'd be as balanced if my ex reached out with a confession like that." I didn't respond to Derek's email, not because I wanted to punish him with silence but because there was genuinely nothing to say. His apology was noted and accepted in the abstract sense that I didn't wish him continued suffering, but it didn't require acknowledgement from me. The work of forgiving Derek had happened months earlier, not as a gift to him but as a gift to myself, releasing the anger that had consumed energy I wanted to spend elsewhere. His email was just punctuation on a chapter I'd already finished writing, a final acknowledgement that we both understood how badly he'd failed and how well I'd succeeded despite him. As the year drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on the full arc of transformation. 3 years from cafe humiliation to this moment, sitting in the studio I owned, reviewing proposals that would carry my business into another year of growth. 3 years from being called too stupid for basic business concepts to being invited to speak at conferences about entrepreneurship and creative leadership. 3 years from crying in a hotel room, convinced I'd never feel whole again, to going home each night to a husband who celebrated my intelligence and success without feeling threatened by either. The woman in the mirror looked like someone who'd survived fire and emerged not just intact but somehow more herself than she'd been before the burning. The scars were there if you knew where to look, moments when self-doubt crept in uninvited, times when I had to consciously override the voice that sounded like Derek telling me I was overreaching. But those moments were increasingly rare, overpowered by evidence that accumulated with each successful project, each satisfied client, each award that Magnolia received for our work. I'd proven to myself in ways no one else could have proven that Derek's assessment of my capabilities had been wrong, that the stupid one in our relationship hadn't been me. New Year's Eve found Adrian and me at a party hosted by one of his artist friends, surrounded by Charleston's creative community, the kind of people who valued authenticity over status and substance over surface. At midnight, when fireworks exploded over the harbor and everyone kissed their partners, I held my husband close and felt grateful for every terrible thing that had happened to lead me here. Derek's cruelty had been the catalyst for transformation I wouldn't have chosen but desperately needed. The cafe humiliation had been the fire that burned away everything false, leaving only what was essential and true. And my vanishing act, the complete disappearance that had terrified everyone back in Portland, had been the space I needed to discover who I was without anyone telling me who I should be. Magnolia Creative Studio entered its 4th year under my ownership with a full pipeline of projects, a team that had grown to 23 people, and a reputation that extended well beyond Charleston. I was no longer the woman who'd fled Portland in pieces. I was the woman who'd rebuilt herself brick by brick, creating something solid enough to withstand whatever storms might come. And if Derek sometimes heard about my success through mutual connections or saw my name in industry publications, well, that was just the universe delivering its own brand of justice. I'd gotten everything I'd wanted from life by refusing to let anyone else define my worth. That was the best revenge of all, though I'd long since stopped thinking of it as revenge. It was just life, the one I'd earned, the one I deserved, the one I'd built with my own allegedly stupid hands. The years continued their forward march, bringing changes and challenges and unexpected gifts. By the 5th anniversary of leaving Portland, Magnolia Creative Studio had expanded to include a satellite office in Atlanta, giving us presence in 2 southeastern markets. Adrian's gallery had opened that second location in Asheville he'd been dreaming about. We'd bought a historic home in Charleston's Harleston Village, spending weekends renovating it together. The life we were building felt permanent rather than provisional, grounded in mutual respect and genuine partnership. I rarely thought about Derek anymore, though I heard through Naomi that he'd married someone in Denver, a woman who apparently matched his ambition without triggering his insecurity. I hoped that was true, hoped he'd learned enough from his catastrophic failure with me to treat his new wife with the respect he'd failed to show me. Whether he had or hadn't wasn't my concern. My energy went toward the business I was growing, the marriage I was nurturing, the life I was living with intentionality and joy. Sometimes, usually late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd think about that morning at the Brew Haven Cafe, the moment Derek called me stupid in front of his laughing friends. The memory no longer carried the sharp pain it once had. Instead, it felt almost like it had happened to someone else, a woman I'd known briefly but had long since parted ways with. That woman had believed Derek's assessment of her worth, had internalized his dismissal, had thought maybe she really was too stupid for his world. This woman, the one I'd become, knew better. Knew that intelligence came in many forms, that business acumen wasn't the only measure of value, that someone who had to make others small to feel big was revealing their own limitations rather than anyone else's. The triumph wasn't in Derek's eventual recognition of what he'd lost, though that had come. The triumph was in having built a life so completely separate from him that his recognition became irrelevant. I didn't need his apology to feel successful. I didn't need his regret to validate my worth. I'd given all of that to myself through years of hard work and honest self-examination and refusing to accept anyone else's diminishing assessment of my capabilities. That was the story I'd wanted to tell, the one I'd shared at conferences and in quiet conversations with people who needed to hear that rebuilding was possible. Because it was possible. It was hard and painful and required facing truths you'd rather avoid, but it was absolutely possible. You could go from broken to whole, from humiliated to respected, from convinced of your inadequacy to confident in your capabilities. You could take the worst thing someone ever said about you and use it as fuel to prove them wrong, not for their benefit but for your own. You could vanish from a life that didn't fit and emerge somewhere new as someone truer to your actual self. You could survive being called stupid by someone who claimed to love you and go on to build an empire that proved stupidity was never the problem. The cruelty was the problem. The insecurity was the problem. The need to diminish others to feel adequate was the problem. And none of those problems had ever been yours to fix. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.